woke to beeping and antiseptic that tasted like someone else's life. The world felt muffled like a record someone had turned down. There was a weight on my chest from the breathing tube, a cotton taste in the mouth, and the sensation of being both very small and very exposed at once. For a moment, I could not place where I was or who the man standing by the curtains was. His silhouette was familiar, the shape that had shared a kitchen, a bed, a child, but his posture had a distance to it I had never seen before. He had come into the room holding a stack of paper. The kind of papers that say the end of something important in crisp, legal type. He set them on the narrow table like he was arranging objects on a shelf, looked down without searching my face, and the motion itself spoke more than the content of the pages ever could. I felt my throat tighten and the monitor's rhythm wobble in response. There was no flourish, no sorrow, no softening. It was, in its own economy, efficient, he had decided. While I lay half present between sleep and clarity, to sever the life we had built together, there are thieves that take jewelry and there are thieves that take names and roles. He took mine with a practiced hand. The petition for divorce was pressed into my palm like a verdict. He explained that signing would keep things civil, that it would spare everyone unnecessary pain, that he would see to our daughter and the mortgage. The words were clean and practiced, as if spoken by someone who had rehearsed Exile. In the sleep-tangled hours after surgery. Betrayal registered as a physical thing, the way the room seemed to tilt, the way sunlight became an accusation. He thought I would be disoriented enough to acquiesce. He thought my husband's agency entitled him to choose while I was vulnerable. He assumed the story he had written about us was the only script available. He did not know that the story had other threads under the surface. He did not know that the small lists he imagined I could not keep, bills, savings, client names, had been quietly rearranged into a life of my own making. He did not ask. He never asked. He took his assumptions and walked out with them like a man carrying a prize he had not earned. We married young, with a shared hunger for something better than what we came from. Our beginnings were modest and energetic. Secondhand furniture, borrowed dreams, plans scribbled on napkins. He loved the shine of progress. I loved the steady work it took to reach it. He took risk in public applause. I took hours with clients late at night when the apartment was quiet and bills were due. Somewhere along the way, his career became a tidal force that reshaped everything in its path. He called himself a provider and made that role into the architecture of our lives. Assuming that the beaming light of his visible success would mask the quiet economies I tended, when our daughter arrived, the expectations around care intensified. He suggested that I step back, that my career could be flexible, that motherhood was the highest, most noble employment. I agreed because I loved my child and because love sometimes asks for trade-offs. Yet the personality that had once loved the idea of my ambition did not die. It adapted. By teaching me to shrink, he believed he could keep the house of marriage in a single admirable configuration, his work at the center, my labor at the margin, but people learn in different ways. While he played the social role of a husband with neat appointments and golf and board dinners, I learned the quiet agility of survival. I had been a good student of systems, how to turn a handful of contract hours into a steady freelance practice, how to make one client into two when deadlines overlapped, how to build reputation in small circles until that reputation began to ripple. I took continuing legal education courses at night, renewed my certifications, took an edge of risk in a field that valued discretion. My clients were not glamorous. They were real people and small firms who needed meticulous legal research and careful filings. Their word spread. I kept my accounts separate in part for privacy and in part because, in small things, privacy is the scaffold of future choice. When the account finally crossed 6 figures, it happened with the muted dignity of someone stacking plates. It did not require a party. One year when tax returns were filed, the number surprised me most for what it meant in quiet sovereignty: $130,000 in income, earned by my own hands and regulated by my own discipline. I did not publish that number on social media. I did not buy new sofas or flaunt the figure. I organized the account so that our household obligations were covered and a comfortable margin existed for emergencies and for education. I kept receipts. I kept records. I kept the ordinary proof of work that had nothing to do with his view of my value. So when he slid the divorce papers across the hospital bed, he expected a small, acquiescent woman who needed his help. Instead, I felt a slow, heatless clarity. His attempt to corner me in vulnerability had been miscalculation. There was a ledger he never imagined would exist in that room, not only the legal documents, demanding separation, but also the quiet accounting of my life. What followed was a strange choreography of performance. He moved to secure his pleasures quickly, calls made in curt tones, bags packed with the air of finality, conversations with a woman whose name, Sam, circulated in company gossip. He told neighbors with carefully curated calm that he was doing the right thing. The world outside our apartment had ways of colluding with assumptions. People like tidy stories. And a woman immobilized by surgery is easier to believe powerless than a woman with a flourishing independent ledger. I did not reveal everything at once. Instead, I worked like a patient strategist, assembling documents and counsel with the quiet insistence of someone building a small fortress. My attorney, the woman I had advised informally for a long time, listened to the outline of my life and did not gasp. She cataloged. She turned my spreadsheets into exhibits and my bank statements into undeniable narratives of labor. The affair emerged into paper. The unauthorized transfers he had made from our joint account were recorded and timestamped. The photos of him with Sam were collected. In rooms that smelled of coffee and legal precedent, we converted quiet truth into admissible fact. Mediation arrived as a kind of feeder. He entered with a smirk and a posture that had been trained by privilege. He read claims aloud with the confident pronouncement of one who expects applause. The scene was both grotesque and cinematic, a man convinced that the arcs of his life were the only arcs. Then the documents unfolded. The evidence of his infidelity landed like a sound in an empty room. The proof that he had attempted to siphon our shared funds into margins of his own making had weight. And then my income records, each year, each contract, the geometry of independence in black and white. The mediation table for all the choreography of lawyers and polite nods was suddenly a crucible in which assumed narratives melted. He had always believed that control could be maintained through small humiliations and social theater. He had never imagined that the woman he thought small had been investing hours into work that built a life for herself and her child. When my earnings were revealed, the shock on his face was not only for financial recalculation. It was a recognition that the person he had tried to render invisible had a gravity he had not accounted for. The shock was also shame, and shame can resort to two immediate responses: argument or self-preservation. He chose argument first, as if contesting the facts might let him keep the fiction. The court became our public stage. The papers were filed: custody petitions, claims of neglect, countersuits with the meticulousness of someone who had learned to protect herself. In testimony, I presented mornings with small details and receipts that held the weight of ordinary truth: the invoices, canceled checks, the emails confirming paid work. I did not attempt rhetorical flourish. I narrated labor, and labor has a legal persistence. The judge listened with a kind of patient economy. The room held its breath. Public opinion, always a loud neighbor, took sides in whispers. Some called me calculating. Some called me brave. The kinds of labels people hand out like pebbles do not matter as much as the fact that law honors records, not gossiped out at the climax. In a narrow courtroom where the dust of many past struggles seemed to settle between the wood and the light, the decision came not as a dramatic thunderclap but as a careful, inevitable settling of things into place. The judge, whose face was composed by habit and whose voice carried the necessary finality, recognized the truth in the papers. The custody arrangement favored steadiness of care. The house remained with the mother who provided it with routine and security. His attempts at financial isolation were undone by the record of his transfers and by the independent account that proved my capability and contribution. He left with bruised entitlement and the thin consolation of mobility. His new apartment could not hold the weight of the life he had expected to walk away with. The aftermath felt oddly quieter than someone might expect. There was no trumpet of triumph. The child who had sat between two roles, father's ambition and mother's tender insistence, had watched adults fright and recompose around them. The victories were logistical: secured custody, legal recognition, the affirmation that small, sustained labor is real capital. The deeper work, the one that has no legal docket, began slowly. He who had once given me the most pain had also taught his son a certain grammar of expectation. Unlearning that grammar took time. I used the freedom with a kind of moral deliberation. The funds I controlled were not spent in ostentation. There were practical choices, paying off lingering debt that had been a small humiliation, setting aside security for school, building a modest emergency fund, and investing in legal aid programs for other women who had been made small. I created a scholarship for single mothers, returning to education, and began funding a small community legal clinic that offered advice on domestic financial abuse. The money became a tool for reconstruction rather than a display. There were private, human things that the court could not order. Reconciliation with my child was a process of ordinary gestures, breakfast on Saturdays, the slow return of jokes, the mutual learning of mistakes and forgiveness. He asked, at first in halting sentences, about regret. He wanted to understand why his father had been as he was and why, despite everything, I could not simply be the hurt person he expected. He discovered in time that indignation is corrosive and humility is slow. He began to volunteer at the community center, hand in the same gloves he had watched me hand out to others, learning that doing is a corrective to entitlement. If there is a final lesson in the arc of those long months, it is that agency is often less dramatic than people imagine. It is built in the small hours of consistent work, in the resumption of morning routines after upheaval, in the manner of choosing to direct resources toward repair rather than spectacle. The man who thought he could divest himself of responsibility by walking into a hospital room and unrolling papers discovered, to his astonishment, a woman whose economic life had been quietly accruing all along. The hospital bed was a poor stage for his ambition because the truth had been counting in the dark. I had been patient and deliberate. He had been theatrical and impatient. When the pages were turned and the prints laid down in court, the record was clearer than any speech. Labor forms life into something real. I did not want revenge. I wanted safety, dignity, and a future for the child who had once wrapped tiny arms around my neck and whispered sleep like a prayer. In the end, the quiet work had not only saved my life, but also reclaimed the story of what it means to be seen. Now, months later, when the kettle hisses and sunlight angles in through the curtains, I keep the small framed drawings on the refrigerator. My daughter runs down the hall and drops crayons like confetti. The apartment is quieter in a way that is not lonely but settled. Sometimes I look at the stack of paper I once held in a hospital bed and remember how close hands had come to choosing for me. I know, as plainly as a ledger, that independence does not require spectacle. It requires fidelity to small acts of labor and to the courage of showing up, again and again, for the life you want to live.